By far one of the most important events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution resulted in the end of over 300 years of Romanov rule and the creation of a new superpower that would dominate a large part of the world for decades. But what exactly led up to this moment? What caused the Russian Revolution? Arguably, there wasn't a single reason. The origins of this event can be traced to several issues plaguing the Russian Empire. It's best to lay them all down and go over them one by one. These reasons are rule stagnation, the Industrial Revolution and its consequences, the lack of reform, and, finally, loss of faith in the Tsar. Going over the first, the peoples of the Russian Empire lived overwhelmingly in the countryside. Consisting of a larger portion of the population when compared to other European countries, the peasants had the potential to exert a lot of influence. And by influence, I mean, we'll kill you if you mess with us. While contact between peasants of different communities was rather limited, and cultures varied, most of them shared similar issues, the greatest issue being a shortage of land. At the turn of the century, Russia had experienced a rapid growth in population. With most of the population living in rural areas, this contributed to a land shortage, especially in western Russia. While it may seem weird that such a vast country would suffer from a land shortage, the issues start to make sense once we start taking a closer look. Just like in the Metro franchise, most of Russia was a barren wasteland. Settling new land wasn't always an option. However, your average Russian peasant still possessed a sizable plot, at least when compared to other countries such as France and Germany. But what they didn't have was the same level of expertise and tools as the rest of Europe. Farming tools were still rather basic, tractors were almost non-existent, plows were made of wood, horses weren't plenty, and a lot of the work had to be done by hand. Techniques, such as crop rotation, weren't commonplace and were hard to practice due to the way peasant communities divided their land. Russian agriculture was basically stuck in the Middle Ages, and it would take a tremendous amount of effort to bring it up to the times, effort that Nicholas was too incompetent to exert. On top of that, the peasants weren't always in favor of changes, such as seen in the case of Sergei Semyonov, whom tried to reform his village from within but was stopped by stubborn village elders. The only realistic option to solve this issue, at least in the short term, was to seize land from the rural elite. The peasants had for centuries dreamed of the day when the Tsar would free them from serfdom and redistribute the nobility's land that they worked on. It appeared that this dream was about to come true when Tsar Alexander II declared the emancipation of the serfs in 1861. But the unfortunate reality was that the land that the peasants were given was only a mere 3.5 hectares. On top of that, they had to pay for it, with an annual interest rate of 5.6%, that would take most of them 49 years to pay off. The burden of serfdom would continue to weigh down on the peasants even as Russia entered the 20th century. After the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, his successors were much more conservative and less inclined to give up the land of the struggling nobility. During the 1905 revolution, the countryside was struck by a wave of violence as the peasants began taking matters into their own hands. As the revolution failed, the peasants found themselves at the receiving end of reprisals from the state, with many of them being hung. All this did was create resentments towards the Tsar and created a breeding ground for communist propaganda. When the February Revolution broke out in 1917, it's no wonder that what Nicholas believed to be a bastion of conservative values didn't come to his defense. When Lenin issued the Decree on Land right after the October Revolution, the peasants had essentially gotten what they wanted, thus had no reason to oppose the Bolsheviks, at least for the next few months. Moving on to the next point, industrialization. Out of all the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, the most relevant for this video would be the creation of a new social class, the proletariat. According to the population census of 1897, only about 13.7% of Russia's population lived in towns and cities. Despite only housing a minority of the population, the cities were still the centers of power, specifically Petrograd, and whoever controlled them could wield significant influence. With the Industrial Revolution going on, the proletariat only grew larger and larger. The conditions that the new social class were forced to work and live in were absolutely horrific, with soul-crushingly low wages and long work hours. The fact that the Russian elite were able to dance and dine in luxury only served to exacerbate class tensions. With all the problems they faced, the working class went in search of solutions. It just so happens that a few decades prior, a man by the name of Karl Marx had written the Communist Manifesto, following it up with Das Kapital. To give Marx some credit, his analysis of the situation of the working class was spot on, and his solution of seizing the means of production was quite popular. The ideas of Marx began taking root in Russia's universities during the late 1800s, with the intelligentsia acting as leaders and agitators of the socialist movement. Obviously, these ideas were incompatible with the Tsarist autocracy, and it would take some smart thinking to counter this threat. But Nicholas didn't really have a plan apart from his typical persecution of opponents. Many socialists were expelled from university, exiled, imprisoned, conscripted, or even killed. With his continued failure to resolve Russia's many social issues, more and more people joined the socialist cause. Interestingly, the syndicalist movement that emerged from Russia's cities wasn't closely tied to socialism, at least initially. Their main objectives consisted of basic demands such as an increase in pay and less working hours. Despite these moderate demands, workers' syndicates were declared illegal. In an attempt to keep the workers away from the revolutionary left, the head of the Moscow political police, Sergei Zubotov, tried experimenting with the creation of police-managed workers' syndicates called Zubotovshchina. But this failed, as whenever the syndicates went on strike, the police always took the side of the industrialists, often opening fire on the workers. It would be these disgruntled factory workers that, in 1917, would seize Russia's major cities and force Nicholas to abdicate from power. Part of the reason why Nicholas failed to stop the socialist movement brings us to the third point, the lack of reform. It should be of no surprise to hear that Imperial Russia was lagging behind the rest of Europe in terms of infrastructure and bureaucracy. Most relevant would be Russia's stance on monarchism and civil liberties. In countries such as Britain and Germany, the ruling monarchs were forced to make some concessions, sharing power with elected officials and granting rights to their citizens. Not only did these governments operate more efficiently, but better satisfy the demands of the populace. But in Russia, things were a little different. For most of its history, Russia was quite literally the personal property of the Tsars. To quote the historian Orlando Figes, the concept of the state was embodied in the Tsar as sovereign or lord of all Russian territory. The system put its subjects at his mercy. If they displeased him, the Tsar could take away their land. They had no property rights to protect them from the state. It also didn't help that Russian civil society was quite weak, with the peasants being confined to their villages and the urban populace devoid of any institutions to represent them. There was very little that anyone could do to counter the power of the Tsar. If changes were to be made, it would have to be done by him. But obviously, that didn't happen. When Nicholas ascended the throne, he was unprepared to govern. The only plan he had was to try his best at upholding the autocracy. During the 1905 revolution, opposition parties, notably the liberal KPD, tried to convince Nicholas to adopt the constitution and to share power with an elected parliament. They managed to get the October Manifesto, which was a constitution in all but name. The manifesto granted civil liberties, established a parliament called the Duma, and, most importantly, established that laws had to be approved by the Duma. In theory, Russia would now be subject to the rule of law and people protected from state oppression, but in practice this was far from the truth. The Duma lacked any real authority to counter the power of the Tsar and was forcefully dissolved on several occasions. Trying to reform the state from within the confines of the law proved incredibly difficult without any real counter to the Tsar's authority. With the KPD unwilling to pursue ulterior methods, the masses lost any faith they may have had in them, opting to support more revolutionary organizations. Going back to the countryside, the new Prime Minister, Pyotr Stolypin, tried conducting a land reform to create a new class of private farmers that would support the Tsar. For some context, the resources that the peasants had, such as seeds, tools, and land, were owned communally by the village. Stolypin believed that by allowing the peasants to privatize their plots of land, they could rid themselves of the backwards communal system, thus solving the land issue. But this was only moderately successful, with around 20% of farmers in 1916 owning the rights to their land. To cite Orlando Figes again on why the reform didn't succeed, much of the problem lay in the lack of an adequate bureaucratic structure to carry out the reforms. The government was trying to transform the peasants' way of life without giving them any real political advantage. The pioneer peasants, like Semyonov, lacked the authority to overcome the difficult obstacles they had to face in order to abandon the communal property. Without the democratization of local government, Stolypin's reforms were doomed to fail. Now, the fourth and final point, the loss of faith in the Tsar. The myth of the good Tsar persisted in Russia for centuries, propagated by the monarchy itself as it helped grant legitimacy to the autocracy. To summarize the myth, it portrayed the Tsar as a just ruler who was close to his people, receiving petitions from humble peasants and even getting personally involved in resolving disputes. If anything bad were to happen, then it was never the fault of the autocrat, but of the boyars or some other scapegoat. Kind of reminds me of a certain someone. With the passing of time, this myth was challenged by the changing social climate. The final nail in the coffin for the good Tsar myth was when a peaceful protest led by Father Gapon was shot at by government troops while trying to present to Nicholas a petition in an event that would be labeled as Bloody Sunday. With his continued failure to reform Russia and the outbreak of World War I, faith in Nicholas only continued to falter. When he assumed command of the army and headed off to the front, people then began blaming him for the army's poor performance. By the time of the February Revolution, not even his generals had faith that he could handle the situation and pressured him to abdicate. To mention a few honorable points as to what caused the revolution, we have the impact of nationalist movements and the outbreak of World War I. The Russian Empire had attempted for the longest time to assimilate, or, at the very least, subjugate the various minority groups within it, such as the Poles, Ukrainians, Finns, etc. This oppression of ethnic and cultural identities obviously resulted in resentment against the autocracy and the Russian majority. But this resentment largely expressed itself once the revolution had begun and was not a direct cause for the unrest that toppled Nicholas in February 1917. The overall influence of nationalist groups outside of their own republics was minimal, being overshadowed by larger factions such as the Bolsheviks that were able to transcend ethnic boundaries. The impact of these groups was largely felt when the Civil War broke out, as the Whites and the Reds tried to reconquer the former possessions of the Tsar. As for World War I, what it really did was exacerbate an already tense social and economic situation that created the conditions for a revolution. Most notably was the strain that the war created on Russia's rail infrastructure, which led to a shortage of food in the cities, causing people to riot. The Russian Revolution was ultimately the culmination of various factors, as well as Nicholas's inability to handle the situation. As mentioned before, he was committed to upholding the autocracy at any cost. He was only ever willing to make compromises when he had no other choice, but even then, it was too little too late. He had demonstrated that trying to reform Russia via legal methods was straight up impossible. So, for many, the Tsar had to go. All the Russians and the people of their empire are, for better or for worse, rather resilient in the face of hardship. They are still human. They still have their limits. The conditions that they were living in were simply intolerable, especially when you take into consideration how far the rest of Europe had progressed. Something needed to be done. While their intentions were noble, most liberals were unwilling to step out of the confines of the law and truly challenge the power of the monarchy. The one group that was willing to take the fight to the extreme was the socialist movement. With people growing more and more tired of the situation, they began seeking more extreme alternatives. The reason why the socialists succeeded where others failed was because they actually gave people a way out. They gave people hope at creating a brighter future. After all, why try to reform the current order to no avail when you can just tear it down and start over? While they weren't perfect, especially the more brutal individuals, the socialists arguably achieved more in the first few months of 1917 than the Tsar had in the past decade. Even when the Bolsheviks took power, most people viewed them as a better alternative to the white movement that aimed to return things to the status quo. And thus, the Russian Revolution would go on to shape the world that we live in to this day, and should be seen as a lesson of what happens when people are pushed to their very limits.
¿Qué pedirías tú para este año? A ver.
Me pediría que se vayan los peruanos de acá.
Eso pediría.
Oh my God.
Oh, concha de tu madre, ¿qué es eso?